Ukraine, according to Donald Trump, Ukraine has until Thursday to sign on to this deal. And the Germans are pissed off about it, and supposedly the Germans are saying, well, this is a provocation, and they're upset at the Americans for this, etc., etc. But here's the thing. If Ukraine signs on to the deal, it would mean Ukraine becoming a protectorate of the Europeans, becoming the protectorate of the European Union, which would mean Germany becoming the protector of Ukraine. And this would give the opportunity and a further green light for the Germans to increase and to really boost tremendously their military power, their military might, and to really revive German power. Because the Americans are saying, okay, Ukraine, if you sign on to this, that means that you agree that you will never become a member of NATO, which means Ukraine is not something that we are obligated to protect because you're not a member of NATO. But if you become a protectorate of the European Union, that means that you are under the watchful eye of the Germans. And the Germans then have the chance and the space to argue that because they are responsible for Ukraine's territorial integrity, and because the Russians have already taken over eastern Ukraine, which we, the Deutsche, the Germans, believe is rightfully Ukrainian territory and not Russian, and because the Americans have pressured the Ukrainians to sign on to this deal, and thus that means that we cannot rely nor trust the Americans, we cannot rely on nor trust the Americans, then we as Germany must become Deutschland über alles. We as Germany must go back to being a serious power again. We must transform ourselves from being Germany, the nice little NATO country, to being Deutschland, the Fourth Reich über alles. And this is exactly what the Americans want. The Americans want to provoke the Germans into reviving their military power. So the Americans are saying, okay, Ukraine, you must sign on to this deal. We're pressuring you to sign on to this deal in which you agree to relinquish eastern Ukraine, aka the Donbass. Are the Russians going to agree to this? We don't know. But here's the thing. Even if the Russians don't agree to it, even if this deal is never signed on to, the geopolitical effect in regards to Europe, specifically and especially Germany, will already be made. And why do I say this? Because it's still a fact. It is still true. It is still the reality that the United States has been and is pressuring the Ukrainians to relinquish eastern Ukraine to Russia. And the Germans can always use this fact from now into the future that they cannot trust the Americans due to the fact that the Americans pressured the Ukrainians to submit to the desire and the demands of Russia. Because the Russians want Ukraine to give up eastern Ukraine. They want Ukraine to give up the Donbass. That's what they want. And here is Donald Trump telling the Ukrainians, Ukraine, Zelensky, you have until Thursday to agree to this 28-point plan in which you relinquish the Donbass to Russia and fulfill this desire and demand of Putin and the Kremlin and Russia. The Germans can always use this fact from now into the future to justify this narrative that they cannot rely on the Americans, and therefore this is the reason why we must go back to being a military power and must revive German military strength, might, and power. In other words, They want to use this, and they have been using this, really, this idea that they cannot rely on the Americans to justify ushering in the Fourth Reich. All these Western countries, really America, Germany, Great Britain, who have been sending weapons to Ukraine, wanted to see how their toys, how their military technology would match up against a modern-day Russian military, the current modern-day Russian military. They wanted to see how their weapons would handle the Russian military. The Germans dumped all these old tanks into Ukraine. They said, oh, here, Ukraine, here are tanks, take our tanks, yeah, take our tanks. And the Ukrainians said, oh, thank you so much, Deutschland. And people must have thought, oh, look, the Germans, they're such nice people. They gave all these tanks, all these Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And all that Germany did was give a bunch of old clunkers to Ukraine. They gave a bunch of old junk tanks to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians tried to use said tanks, and those tanks got destroyed by the Russian tanks, by Russian military technology. And the Germans wanted this to happen because they wanted to see how their old clunkers would handle Russian weaponry, Russian military technology. And they saw their tanks getting destroyed. And the Germans were looking with binoculars, and they said, Hans, please write down the details as to why the tanks got destroyed. And they took the details showing why their tanks got destroyed, and they built on that knowledge and adapted to the situation, and they have recently completed the construction and the formation of a brand new state-of-the-art Leopard tank. So Ukraine, since 2022, has been being used by the West as a laboratory, as a testing ground for NATO technology to see how it does against Russia's military. But the Americans have a plan. And the plan is to unleash Deutschland, to get Germany to revive its power and to go back to being a Reich again. And this is a pattern in Germanic history. The world has witnessed this for a very, very long time. A very long time. Since far, far antiquity, mankind has witnessed the Germans rising to power and dominating Europe. You can go all the way back to the days of the Roman Empire. The Germans ended up crushing the Romans, and the Germans ended up invading Rome several times. And eventually the Germans would invade Rome and crush the western half of the Roman Empire when it was clearly a dying empire. And you could fast forward to the rise of Prussia, how Prussia took over pretty much all of Germany, defeated the Austrians, how the Prussians defeated the French Empire. And you could read about the 30 Years' War before that, and how the majority of the war took place where? In which part of Europe? In Germany. And that was the bloodiest war that Europe ever went through before World War I. And then you go to World War I, you see Germany at the head in World War I. You see Germany dominating Great Britain, dominating France. You see Germany defeating the Russians. You see Germany facilitating the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and getting the Russians to withdraw from the war. And then we have World War II, and we all have heard that story. And so we all know this story. We all know this movie. There have been many parts of this cinematic universe. And so we're seeing what? We're seeing the next part, the next expansion of this cinematic universe called Deutschland. Trump wants Germany to take over NATO. I mean, this never made major news, guys. And the only major Western publication that I saw talking about this, publishing this story, is The Telegraph. That's it. It's quite remarkable. But look at this article. Look at what it says here. Look at what it says here. Germany should take over the historically American role of NATO Europe commander. Donald Trump's envoy to the Western Alliance has suggested. Matthew Whitaker, the U.S. ambassador to NATO, said he hoped Germany would one day volunteer for the prestigious role of Supreme Allied Commander Europe. They want Deutschland to revive its power. He told the Berlin Security Conference, quote, I look forward to the day when Germany comes to the United States and says that we're ready to take over the Supreme Allied Commander position. I think we're a long way from that, but I look forward to those discussions. Now, the Americans have been working on this for a very long time. You can go all the way back to Donald Trump's first term and even before that, and you can see that the American empire, the United States, has been working to revive German power and to enable the revival of German power. And you see the American ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, just outright saying it, just explicitly saying this. We want Germany to become powerful. Mr. Whitaker added that Washington would like to see Europe's military capabilities become equal to America's. They want Europe to be just as powerful as the United States. And if you have a Europe that is just as powerful as the United States, that would mean a revived German superpower. And so the Americans are saying, okay, we want you, Germany, to become just as powerful as the United States. Now look at what it says here. Since NATO was founded in 1949, the post of Supreme Allied Commander Europe has been held by an American, typically a four-star general who oversees the alliance's military activities in Europe. The current occupant of the role is General Alexis G. Grinkovich of the U.S. Air Force. The first U.S. officer to hold the post was Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Second World War hero and 34th U.S. president. For months, rumors have swirled that the United States is eager to step back from the role and allow a European general to take command. Now, what did I say about Donald Trump's 28-point plan? The plan stipulates that Ukraine will relinquish the Donbass region to Russia, which is what the Russians want. And so even if Ukraine doesn't sign on to it, even if the Russians don't sign on to it, even if the agreement, even if the plan is never agreed to, the message that the Americans are conveying to the Germans is, we are willing to try to fulfill the demands of Russia. And we are willing to enable the Russians to control eastern Ukraine. We are willing to get the Ukrainians to relinquish territory to the Russians, who are the arch nemesis of the Germans. And so the Germans will use this, they're already using it in fact, to say, hey, we can't trust the Americans. Look, they're trying to do the bidding of Russia. They're trying to fulfill the demands of the Russians, of the Kremlin, our arch enemy. Russia, the country that has been our enemy, the enemy of Deutschland, going all the way back as far as the First World War. And so we must make Germany powerful again. We cannot rely on the Americans. So even if the agreement is never made, the message has been sent. And the agenda of reviving German power is still being advanced. That's the whole point. So the Americans are saying, Ukraine, you have until Thanksgiving to make this agreement. And Ukraine is saying, oh my God, this is terrible. Zelensky's saying, oh my God, this is terrible, terrible. The Americans are forcing us to give up territory, oy vey. And the Germans are saying, ja, America, Amerikanska, Amerikaner. Why are you trying to do the bidding of the Kremlin? Why are you doing the bidding of Putin? Why are you trying to pressure poor Ukraine to fulfill the demands of its occupier, Russia? Why? We must make Deutschland great again. And the Americans and the Germans behind closed doors are telling each other, great job. Germany is saying, thank you, America, for giving us the green light so that we can come back, so that we can get the band back together, so to speak, so we can make Deutschland great again. And the Americans are saying, Deutschland, we want you to rise up so you can defeat the Russians. You see? To me, the way I look at it is it's a good cop, bad cop type of scenario. America pretends to be this country that's pressuring Ukraine. Well, it's not pretending it is pressuring Ukraine, but America is playing the role of the superpower, of the global power that is pressuring Ukraine to give up territory. And Germany is coming in as the good cop to be the friend of Ukraine. When the reality is that Germany is using this entire situation to justify reviving its power. Mr. Whitaker's remarks suggest the Trump administration would like to see Germany eventually overtake America. Overtake America as the main security guarantor in Europe. It follows a pledge by Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, to rebuild the Bundeswehr armed forces into the, quote, strongest conventional army in Europe. Germany is back, Mr. Merz has claimed. Back. Back to where? The Third Reich? The Nazi Empire? Mr. Whitaker's comments about the post of Supreme Allied Commander Europe going to Germany ruffled some feathers during a panel discussion on European defense. Now, look how the Germans play this game. No, nine, America, nine, we don't want to become powerful again. That is not true. No. Lieutenant General Wolfgang Wein, Germany's representative to NATO and the EU, told the panel he was slightly taken aback by the suggestion. I'm so taken aback, guys. I'm so taken aback. This guy is obviously full of shit. Because the Americans have been talking about reviving German power for years. You can go all the way back to the first Trump administration, the first time that Trump was president. You could see Mike Pence talking about how the Germans need to come back and make their military strong again. The Trump administration made this very clear. This is all just acting. Germany's sitting there saying, I'm taken aback. I don't want this. No, it cannot be me. I am not the right guy. And America is saying, no, it must be you. And this is exactly what the Germans want. Did not Friedrich Merz make it very clear that he wants Europe, or he wants Germany to have the most powerful military in the entire continent? Did not Olaf Scholz say the same damn thing when he was Chancellor of Germany? So why is this German representative in NATO, this Lieutenant General Wolfgang Wein, acting as if he is taken aback? That's obviously bullshit. It's obvious that this is bullshit. That's pretty much the article. But this is, when I saw this article, it's the way I saw it was that it's just another piece of information that sheds light on what I've been warning about since 2016. I've been telling you guys about this since early 2016. And here we are. We have the US government in the Berlin Security Conference making it explicitly clear that America wants Germany to take over America's position as the security guarantor of Europe. And I find it fascinating that Matthew Whitaker says this around the time that Donald Trump gave his 28-point plan to Ukraine, in which the Ukrainians must relinquish eastern Ukraine to the Russians. Because, as I've already said, what message does that send to the Germans? The message that it sends is, well, you can't trust the Americans. You have to get your military back up. So these two events are not coincidental at all. America tells the Ukrainians, you have to give up Eastern Ukraine to Russia for peace. And in the Berlin Security Conference, Matthew Whitaker, the U.S. representative for NATO, tells the Germans, we want you guys to revive your power in Europe. Why? Because they want Germany to take care of Ukraine. They want Germany to become a massive threat to Russia, just as it was a massive threat to the Soviet Union during the Second World War, just as it was a massive threat to Russia during World War I. Most Germans hate the war. They do. You're correct. But as I've said many times before, if you can increase nationalism and make Germans proud, so if they can make you super proud of your country to the point where you are very pride-filled about your country, it's easier for them to convince you to go to war for them. So if you revere your country, you love America, you love whatever country you're living in, and it's like practically a part of your identity, it's much easier to convince you to go to war. Because you love your country, and your countries are going to say you have to go to war because if you don't, we're going to get invaded. And you believe that, and then you go to war. You see, the war in Ukraine has zero psychological effect on Americans. Zero. Some of us may support the Ukrainians. We feel bad for them. We want to help them. We want America to help them, right? Sure, fine. But we're not sitting here losing sleep over Ukraine because we know damn well that we do not share any contiguous border anywhere near Ukraine. But people in Germany live a different reality. They live in a country that borders with Poland. And Poland borders with Russia because it borders with Kaliningrad. And Poland borders with the Baltic region. It borders with Lithuania. Poland is right next to Belarus, which is an extension of Russian power. So Germany, just given its geopolitical proximity to the war, has a much deeper interest and a much deeper psychological investment into this conflict than North Americans do. So you have to keep that in mind. So if Germans become extremely nationalistic to the point where they are very proud of who they are, they're proud of being German, and they want to see Germany become a superpower, and they see Germany become a superpower again, and you have German flags everywhere and German military posters everywhere, and they feel very, very proud, and they become convinced that Russia could actually invade them, then you're looking at an entirely different situation than now. Right now, the feeling in Germany is we are a protectorate of the United States. And so this war, even if you talk to, let's say, German nationalists who vote for AfD or who are fans of the AfD party, their position is we do not want to be involved in this war in Ukraine because this is America's war. This is not Germany's war. This has nothing to do with Germany, and this has everything to do with America's and Britain's interest. But if you take out this status of Germany, the protectorate of America, and you transform it into Germany, the empire, Germany, the Reich, Germany, the most powerful country in Europe, which has autonomy, independence, and which has a thriving military-industrial complex and military weapons industry, then you have a very different perspective. And if that perspective can be transitioned into the minds of the people and get blended into the culture, where you have an integration between the civilian population and civilian life and military culture, then you're looking at a very different zeitgeist. You're looking at a very different spirit for the political climate at hand. Edward Lasker, this guy, This guy was a Jewish individual who was politically aligned with Otto von Bismarck. And Edward Lasker supported the unification of Germany. Because remember, Germany was not always Germany. For much of its history, Germany was just a cluster of different governments, different kingdoms, different governments, etc. And Otto von Bismarck united all these little German governments, all these little German nations, to become one unified country that we today call Germany. This happened in the late 1870s, 1878, I believe. Well, Edward Lasker, who was a Jewish guy, supported this unification of Germany. And unbeknownst to him, it would be this Germany that would almost exterminate his people in the future. So you fast forward to our own time, to the late 20th century, 1980s, 1990s, the neocons wanted, the pro-Israel neocons wanted the reunification of Germany. And now we see this reunified Germany becoming a major power again. And it's deepening ties with which country? Turkey. And which country is right now the biggest existential threat to Israel? The only Jewish state? Turkey. Germany is deepening ties with the country that will orchestrate the second Holocaust. So, in the past, in the 1870s, you had Jewish people who supported the unification of Germany. And in the very near past, in the late 1980s, you had pro-Israel folks, people like Frank Gaffney, who wanted for Germany to be reunified. And now we see this reunified Germany deepening military ties with the biggest existential threat to Israel. History does not exactly repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. It's very interesting to see what's happening, guys. Very interesting. It's scary, don't get me wrong. It's very scary to see this resurgence in German military power and empire. But at the same time, it's interesting because we are seeing massive, massive events that will be seen in the future as major historical happenings. So we are living in pretty serious historical times. We're watching the repeat of history or the rhyming of history play out right before our eyes. It's very surreal to see. Trump is on Russia's side. Top politicians are shocked by peace plan. This came out very recently, this article that is. And the article is showing how the Germans are pissed off at Donald Trump's 28-point plan for Ukraine because, as I have said, the plan stipulates that Ukraine must relinquish eastern Ukraine to Russia. And the Germans are upset because, well, they don't want Russia to win. But at the same time, they are using this whole situation. They are using Donald Trump's proposal. They're using American pressure on Ukraine to relinquish territory to tell their people that they must make their military powerful because they cannot rely on the Americans. That's what's happening here. So let's read some parts of this article here. It says here, ahead of the federal chancellery, Thorsten Frey expressed his irritation at the new U.S. proposal to end the war in Ukraine. Quote, "The initial news reports on this are quite disturbing," Frey said. Frey's party colleague, Roderick Kaiserwetter, said on Thursday the plan by Witkoff and Dmitriev is a capitulation plan. Trump knows this. He's clearly on Russia's side. Ooh, you see this? You see this language? Trump is on Russia's side. Trump is on the side of the Kremlin. We cannot trust Trump. We cannot trust America. America is not a reliable partner. America is no longer a reliable superpower. Germany must grab its destiny and maneuver its own destiny. Germany must lead its own destiny and revive its power, revive its military. That's what's happening here. That's what's happening. And even if Ukraine doesn't sign on to the agreement, this message has been sent, and the Germans are using it as we speak. And they have been doing this sort of thing since Brexit. You can go all the way back to Brexit, when the United States told Great Britain, yeah, Britain, we want you to leave the European Union. Did not Donald Trump support Brexit? Didn't Donald Trump support Nigel Farage's whole Brexit campaign? Donald Trump was fanning the flames. He was pouring gasoline on the fire. He was supporting Brexit. Now, why did the United States government support Brexit? Why? It all goes back to this. It all goes back to this plan to revive German power. Because by removing the British from the European Union, the Germans were then given the pretext to say, we can't rely on the British, because the British were the most powerful military in the EU. The British were also the biggest contributors and the biggest funders for EU defense. And by the British leaving the EU, it forced the Germans to come out and say, we cannot rely on the British. The British have abandoned us. The British are no longer the security guarantors for the European Union. We, Germany, must become the security guarantor for the EU. And thus began the spark, thus ignited the spark to commence the revival of German militarism. And what allowed for that spark to be lit, for that spark to be ignited, was Brexit. And Brexit was pushed by the United States government. It was pushed by far-right media, which was very, very popular. It was pushed by American and British political influencers. And they voted for it. And I remember the night of Brexit, I stayed up all night. I couldn't sleep. Why? Because I knew exactly what it meant. I had a giant glass of iced tea, caffeinated real iced tea, drank all that iced tea, guzzled it down, as I wrote an article about what Brexit actually meant for the future. And I was absolutely right. I said Brexit is going to be used by the Germans to justify reviving German militarism. And I was absolutely right. Absolutely right. And everyone disagreed with me. Everyone said I was a fool. Everyone said, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I said, I know exactly what I'm talking about because that's exactly what's going to happen. This is going to enable the revival of German power. And I was right. I was right. And Brexit was done for that reason, I believe. The Americans, for a very long time, have wanted the Germans to rise up. That's why they reunited Germany. That's why they brought East Germany back with West Germany, because they wanted a powerful Germany to go against the Russians. They saw what the Germans did to the Russians in World War II. And they said, well, if we want to have a war against the Russians, if we want to win against the Russians, then we're going to need the Germans. And so they reunited East and West Germany. They allowed the Germans to be militarily involved in the Balkans in the 1990s because they wanted to see Germany come back. And when you had the migrant crisis pushed or convinced the British people to vote in favor for Brexit, because Boris Johnson said that if the UK did not exit out of the European Union, that the UK would be invaded by migrants. And the British people voted in favor for Brexit. And Donald Trump was all for it. Why? Because the deeper agenda was not British sovereignty from Brussels. Because let's remember, the UK was the biggest funder for the EU's security. If anything, the British had a lot of power in the European Union. The deeper agenda was the revival of German power. And not too long after Brexit happened, there was a massive EU security meeting that took place. Britain did not have a representative in the meeting because it voted in favor for Brexit, even though at that point Britain had not officially exited out of the EU yet. There was a meeting, I believe, in Bratislava, and the Germans had their representative, and the French had their guy there, or multiple guys there. I don't know exactly how many representatives were there, but Germany was there, France was there, other EU countries were there. And what was the main topic? What was the agenda at hand? The agenda was, now that Great Britain has left us, Germany must become a powerful military. Germany and France must get together and establish this massive Franco-Germanic military power. We must have this pan-European military force. And who would lead this pan-European military force? The Germans, of course. And this happened very, very soon after the referendum for Brexit in 2016. Very soon after that. Why so soon? Because that was the agenda. And I told people this, and no one believed me, but here we are. Here we are. And we have the Americans telling the Ukrainians, Ukraine, we want you to give up East Ukraine to Russia, and the Germans are angry. But that's exactly what the Americans want. The Americans want the Germans to be angry, because they want the Germans to be incentivized to revive their military strength. If that were not the case, then Matthew Whitaker would not have told the Germans in the Berlin Security Conference that America wants Germany to become a massive military power, and America wants, in fact, for Europe, led by Germany, to be just as powerful as the United States. So we are seeing the creation of the Fourth Reich. We are watching history happening right before our eyes, and we are watching the rhyming of the symphony of history occurring right before us. And I say, truly, truly, we are living in the most surrealist of times. It's like we're living in a book. It's like we're living in a history book. It's like we're living in a movie. It's like we're living in a video game. It's like we're living in Elden Ring, and you have the various prospective lords who want to become Elden Lord over the lands between. Only for our world, the lands between are the Middle East and Europe. The Middle East is sort of, I guess you could say, yeah, it fits calling it a part of the lands between, because the lands between the Middle East, it's in the middle, it's in between, it's the lands between. Europe is also at the center. It's right there in the center with the Middle East. And Europe and the Middle East, that's the lands between. Okay, so this guy, Roderick Kaiserwetter, who, by the way, wants for Germany to have nuclear weapons. So Kaiserwetter is saying that Donald Trump is not a friend of Europe. He's not on Europe's side. He's on Russia's side. He's on the Kremlin side. And he says here, instead of talking about pointless plans, Europe should finally start supporting Ukraine as if it were already in the EU and NATO. Because, in fact, it is Europe's first line of defense. Europe should therefore develop a plan for victory with Ukraine. We must want to win. If Trump sells weapons to Europe, fine. If not, he should stay out of it. So this guy really wants for German power to take place, to be revived. Because he says here, instead of talking about pointless plans, Europe should finally start supporting Ukraine as if it were already in the EU. So the EU is, economically at least, led by Germany. In the future, it's going to be militarily led by Germany. And he says that we should really be running Ukraine as if it's a part of the EU. So if Ukraine is seen as being a part of the EU, that means what? That means Germany running Ukraine. That's what this guy wants. And he goes on to say, because in fact, it is Europe's first line of defense. That is a very, very important point that this guy is specifying here. The reason why I say it's important is not because I'm believing his words, but because it shows how the Germans think. This is their perspective. So the Russian perspective is Ukraine is a part of Russia. Ukraine historically was a part of Russia, and it was. Ukraine is the birthplace for the Russian Orthodox Church. Ukraine is the reddest of lines for us, and so because NATO wants to control Ukraine, we cannot allow that, because that means that would mean NATO controlling our backyard, and we cannot allow that. That is our sphere of influence. That is a part of Russia. That is a part of the Russo world, the Ruski Mir, as it's known. The German perspective is Ukraine is our first line of defense. Defense against who? Defense against Russia. And so if we lose Ukraine, as the Germans say, that means losing Deutschland's first line of defense against the Russians. And so the Germans are saying we must control Ukraine. We must have our hands in the politics of Ukraine. Just as during the First World War, the Germans had the Bolsheviks convey the Brest-Litovsk Conference. And in that conference, the Germans told the Bolsheviks, okay, you guys have taken over Russia. Russia has lost this war, World War I. So therefore, we are in the position to make demands. And you have no other option but to make concessions, but to relinquish territory. And so, Mr. Bolshevik, you are going to carve out Ukraine for us and declare Ukraine independent. And Germany got exactly what it wanted. And Ukraine got its independence on paper, but all that meant was Germany became the carer or the controller of Ukraine. And Germany saw Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence. In World War II, the Soviets and the Germans were killing each other over Ukraine. So nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. And so the Germans are saying Ukraine is our first line of defense. In other words, the Germans are saying Ukraine is a red line for us. The Russians for decades have been saying Ukraine is the reddest of lines. Ukraine is the reddest of lines for Russia. And if you continue to meddle in Ukraine, there is going to be hell to pay. And fast forward to 2022, and that warning ended up being very, very pertinent. And Russia's warning ended up coming to fruition. And so the Germans are saying Ukraine is a red line. We cannot lose Ukraine. So if the Germans see Ukraine as Germany's first line of defense and Europa's first line of defense, and the Russians see Ukraine as the reddest of lines for their sphere of influence, for their empire, so to speak, that means that it's inevitable that the Germans and the Russians are going to go to war again. They're going to clash again, and they're going to clash over Ukraine. History repeats, right? Or it rhymes. It says here, German military experts are also shocked. Carlo Masala writes on X, they want to force Ukraine to surrender on conditions that make the next attack possible. So you see this language here? This really reflects what the Germans are thinking. The Germans are thinking, if Russia takes over eastern Ukraine, and Russia is allowed to make eastern Ukraine as a part of the Russian Federation, that would mean what? That would mean Russia being close or closer to Poland. That would mean Russia being closer in turn to Germany, to Central Europe, to the heart of Europe, where Germany and Austria lie. And so this is the reason why the Germans are accelerating their military strength. This is the reason why the Germans are pouring in so much money into their military, because they are preparing for a war with the Russians. And what happened in World War I and what happened in World War II is going to happen again. So it says here, political science professor Thomas Yeager told the newspaper U.S. Security guarantees that aim to force Ukraine to capitulate are worthless, because part of Trump's 28-point plan is that if Ukraine signs on to the plan, the United States will give Ukraine security guarantees. Well, here's the problem. The plan also specifies that Ukraine must agree, and must even put it into its constitution, that it will never join the NATO alliance. Well, if Ukraine never joins the NATO alliance, and Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and the Russo-Ukrainian war recommences, America can just say, well, you're not a part of NATO, and so we're not really obligated to help you. And so what America is really trying to say is, we want you to agree to end the fighting. We want you to agree to relinquish territory to Russia, and Europe's going to take care of you. Germany's going to take care of you, but we have no obligation to do anything for you in the future. And so it says here, should the plan come to fruition, it would be the final proof that the U.S. is no longer an ally for us. Now, this is from the German press. This is from the German press. This is the German press saying this, that if this plan comes to fruition, it will be proof that the United States is not an ally of Europe. So we could be seeing a fracturing of the American-European alliance. And regardless, what the Europeans are pursuing is military independence. What they're pursuing is empire. They're pursuing making Europe into a massive military bloc of power, a massive geopolitical powerhouse that would be led by Germany, the Fourth Reich. According to German Foreign Minister Johann Wadefuhl, Germany had no knowledge of the alleged secret talks between the U.S. and Russia. Wadefuhl stated that Germany had, quote, not been briefed on the 28-point plan reported by U.S. media. So what the Germans are saying is the Americans never even told us about this plan. They never consulted us about this plan. And this is a further humiliation of Germany. Germany, like I said, is it's a militarily occupied country. It is under the control of the American empire. And the Americans continue to humiliate the Germans. They humiliated the Germans with the recent trade deal in which Donald Trump got Ursula von der Leyen to agree to have Europe invest somewhere around $1 trillion into the U.S. economy, whereas Europe really doesn't have much of a great deal in that whole trade agreement. And Germany is being humiliated right now with the fact that you have tens of thousands of American soldiers occupying Germany. And Germany got humiliated again with the fact that Donald Trump came up with this 28-point plan for Ukraine, in which Ukraine relinquishes territory to Russia, and Germany was never consulted. Germany was never asked about this plan. Germany was never asked, hey, Germany, what do you think about Ukraine giving up territory to your arch nemesis? And so this is a further humiliation. Germany was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. And that resulted in the election of Adolf Hitler. So it says here, however, Germany is focusing on supporting Ukraine. The German government wants to make it, quote, very clear, unquote, to Putin, quote, that there is no alternative to a negotiation process. Germany will stand by Ukraine permanently, militarily, politically, and economically, the minister emphasized. So the Germans are making it very clear that they are very serious about fighting for Ukraine. So this is all really a very clear and obvious sign that German militarism is getting revived, and the Russo-Germanic war is going to happen again.